Hi guys, Shawn here from digiDirect. Today we're going to be looking at the Fujifilm X-Pro 2. So it's a brand new camera from Fujifilm. It's been very highly anticipated. So just for a quick piece of history, the X-Pro 1 was originally released in 2012. So that was about 4 years ago now. So Fuji fans have been waiting quite some time for a new X-Pro 2, but I think we'll find that it's well worth the wait. The X-Pro 2 is a really nice camera. So we'll jump into the tech specs here in just a second. One thing I want to say off the bat though is that I really enjoyed shooting with the X-Pro 2. It was just, I took the sample photos in this video were taken at the Brunswick Music Festival Street Party, which was just the other day here in Melbourne. And I use cameras every day. It's easy to get critical and a little bit jaded about features and the different, using different cameras. But with the X-Pro 2, I kind of regained some of that pleasure in just shooting for fun. It was just really, really nice to use. I can't really point to one specific feature on the camera that made me feel that way. I think it's more about how all the features blend together really nicely in a holistic way. It's fast in terms of the setup and the menus and the autofocus. It's comfortable to hold. The viewfinder is great. It takes really, really nice photos. Almost every photo that I took ended up looking better than I thought it would. So it's really just how everything works together, and it was just really, really enjoyable to use. So we'll jump into the tech specs. Maybe we can try and find a reason as to why that was the case, but I just thought I'd mention that off the bat here. Every sample photo that you see throughout the video is just a JPEG straight out of the camera. They haven't been edited at all. Okay, so when we look at the X-Pro 2, physically it looks very similar to the X-Pro 1. Now that might be a little bit deceiving because almost every feature on here has been updated and improved. There's actually very little that's exactly the same from the X-Pro 1. So a lot of improvements. I'm not going to touch on every single one here, but we'll look at some of the main notable points. So first up, we're looking at the sensor. This has got a 24 megapixel sensor inside of it, which is quite a jump in resolution from previous Fuji cameras. We've seen 16 megapixel camera sensors in other cameras like the X-T1, X-T10 and so on. So jumping up to 24 megapixels is a big step. It puts it in the same range as most DSLRs and so on. We've seen this start to happen with mirrorless cameras. Typically, most mirrorless cameras, with the exception of Sony's cameras, have been in the 16 megapixel range. We're just now starting to see the manufacturers starting to introduce new cameras with higher resolution sensors. That's the X-Pro 2 in the Fuji line, so that's great to see, a much needed step. Another big improvement we see on the X-Pro 2 is in autofocus. Now this has been a bit of a sore point for Fuji. They're not known for having the fastest autofocus on the market, but the X-Pro 2 goes a long way to really help out with that. There's 273 autofocus points on the X-Pro 2. So that's compared to the the X-T1, which has 77, for example. So, a huge amount more autofocus. I found the autofocus to be very, very fast. Like I said, the sample photos were taken at a street festival. No one's really standing still. There's a lot of movement. I never had an issue where the autofocus wasn't fast enough to keep up with everything there. Almost every photo I took was, nice and sharp, and specifically sharp where I wanted it to be sharp. So I found very, very good autofocus performance coming out of the X-Pro 2, which I think a lot of Fuji users will be happy to hear. Another standout feature that helps a lot with the autofocus is this dedicated autofocus toggle button on the back. So it's kind of a four-way joystick, and really it's dedicated to change your autofocus points. So it's really, really quick and easy to change where you want to set the autofocus point, faster than I've ever been able to do it on any other camera, certainly. I didn't really think that would be something that I would use all the time, but I ended up using it a lot more than I thought, and it was definitely helped me to shoot faster and more efficiently. Now, another very good point about this AF toggle is it's also very useful in the menus. You can use it as a joystick to control your movement around the menus, and it's just really, really fast. I found myself navigating menus in the X-Pro 2 with this toggle really, really quickly. I wasn't sticking around in menus for a long time. It was just really fast in and out, which just adds to the ease of use and the speed of using this camera, which again contributes to its overall enjoyment. You can get out of the way of the menus. You don't want to be stuck in those. Get through it quickly and you're back to shooting. Now, another standout feature we see on the X-Pro 2 is the viewfinder. So pretty much whatever type of viewfinder you like to shoot with, the X-Pro 2 has probably got it. It's got a digital viewfinder, which is very high resolution, one of the nicest digital viewfinders I've ever seen. but it also has the classic optical viewfinder as well, including an optical digital hybrid. So you can have the optical viewfinder with, in the bottom right, you can have a small overlay of the digital viewfinder just to check focus and so on. Now the optical viewfinder is really nice to use. What they've done with the X-Pro 2 is they've added in the addition of what's called bright lines. Now unfortunately I can't show you what it looks like to look through the viewfinder in this video here, but essentially the bright lines are a superimposed rectangle over the optical viewfinder in your main focal length. So you've got 18 millimeters and then a smaller rectangle which is 23 millimeters, 35, 50, so on. So what this does is when you're looking through the optical viewfinder, you can kind of have an idea of where in the frame is going to be, depending on which lens you're using, where in the frame it's going to cover. Now the other advantage of this is that you have a little bit of extra peripheral vision then when using the optical viewfinder, because say you're using a 50 millimeter shot, here's the total viewfinder frame, here's where the bright line is for 50 millimeters. I've got this area outside the bright line where I can see things that are going to be entering my frame. So it's really good for any kind of moving subject. If you've got someone who's going to be walking into the frame, to be able to see just a little bit outside of what the lens is actually going to capture actually goes a long way to helping you compose subjects when there's any kind of movement and so on. And it's really, really good. So basically, whatever kind of viewfinder setup you like, the X-Pro 2 has got it. Whether you like to shoot digital, optical, hybrid, use the bright lines, a mix of all three. It's easy to switch between the different modes using this toggle switch on the front. So really, really excellent performance from the viewfinder here on the X-Pro 2. Okay, so let's take a physical look at the camera. Obviously, I've touched on the viewfinder already. We've got the switch here at the front, which will let you control your viewfinder settings. We've looked at the toggle button on the back for the autofocus points. If we look at the top here, we've got a hot shoe mount. Next we'll see the shutter speed control dial that we're used to seeing on Fuji cameras. One thing to note is that the shutter speed, the mechanical shutter on the X-Pro 2 goes all the way up to 1/8,000th of a second. The X-Pro 1 as well as the XT1, for example, only went up to 1/4000th of a second, so you've got a extra little bit of speed there. Now an interesting point here is, notice this little window in the top of this dial. That's actually the ISO control. So ISO is bundled into the same dial here as the shutter speed, and you change that by lifting up the edge of the dial here and spinning around and choosing whichever ISO you want. So that looks pretty nifty. Some people might think that that's a new design feature. That's actually how it used to be done on old film cameras, from the 60s, for example. We just haven't seen that design in quite a while, but it goes back to giving you that nice retro feel on the X-Pro 2. I'll note though that my favorite aspects of this ISO dial were the automatic controls. So you have 3 automatic ISO controls. You've got your full auto, which is just going to choose whatever ISO it thinks is best based on your shutter speed and aperture and so on. But you've also got low auto and high auto, and these are great because it's still automatic ISO, but you can constrain the range that it will use. For example, if I want to go into low ISO, I can choose the range that will encompass. So I can say, okay, let's say that low will mean between 200 and 400 ISO. I probably don't really care if the camera is going to be shooting at 200 or 250 or 320. It's not really going to make a noticeable difference to my image, but I want to make sure it doesn't pass 400, let's say. So I can set that setting up, put it on low, and I'm good to go. I don't need to worry about adjusting the ISO, but I also don't need to worry that it's going to spike up super high and give me some noise that I might not want. Similarly with the high, we can constrain the high range. I found this really, really useful. I normally don't use auto ISO, but using the low setting mostly, I was able to get a little bit of adjustment when I needed it, not have to adjust it myself, which let me shoot faster, but also know that the ISO wasn't going to jack up super high on me. So I really like that. We've got the on-off switch here, an assignable function button, which by default is your movie record button, although you can change it, of course. And then in the bottom right, we've got your exposure compensation dial, which we're used to seeing. One update on the X-Pro 2 is that we can go up to 5 stops. So we've got the standard 3 stops on the dial itself, but if you set it to this C button here, you can then adjust it up to 5 stops either way. So that's nice. That's a new feature here. If we look around to the side of the camera here, we look at the SD card slot here, we actually see that there's dual SD card slots. So that's very, very cool. That's the first time we've seen that on a Fuji X series camera. This is a nice feature typically for professionals. Say you're shooting a wedding or some kind of event, and you've got that dangerous time between when you're taking the photos and between when you can get home and back it up. And if something happens to your SD card in the meantime, you've got issues, obviously. So having this dual slot means that your photos are backed up to 2 SD cards simultaneously. Gives you that extra step in making sure that if something happens to one card, you still got them backed up on the other one. So that's a really nice kind of pro level feature to have in the X Pro 2. Then if we look on the left side here, we can see they've also managed to include a mic port, so you can plug in an external mic. It is a 2.5 millimeter jack, not a 3.5 millimeter jack, so just bear that in mind. But that touches on the video features on the X Pro 2. Fuji is not known for its video features on their cameras, but they're starting to make steps in the right direction to try and correct that. This mic jack is an example of that. The X Pro 2 can shoot 1080p video up to 60 frames per second, which is pretty good. So again, some steps that we're seeing from Fujifilm here to increase the video capabilities on their cameras, and that's always good. Also of note is that the X Pro 2 is a weather-sealed body. So you can take it out in the rain, it's weatherproof, you'll be fine. The X Pro 1 was not weatherproofed. So that's a nice update to have in the X Pro 2. Okay, so the last point that I want to touch on here is just the menu design on the X Pro 2, which, for some people doesn't necessarily seem like a huge feature, but it actually goes a long way to helping you use the camera quickly, not be stuck in menus, not be messing around all the time. They've redesigned the standard menu for the X Pro 2. It's very intuitive now. Everything is separated by categories. I was able to, turn the camera on for the first time, jump in and change some settings. Everything was where I thought it should be. I didn't have to, really hunt around in menus very much. So right off the bat, it's easy to use the menus, but they've made a lot of customization options that make it even easier. First of all, you've got a lot of customizable function buttons around the camera. We looked at the one on the top already, but we've also got the buttons around, the directional buttons around the menu button. Since we have that dedicated autofocus toggle button, these directional buttons are free to be customizable function buttons. So you've got a lot of function in there that you can customize. They've built in a queue menu, which we've seen on other cameras before, but it pulls up a quick menu essentially. You can customize every single function that will be available in the quick menu. Just a well-implemented example of a queue menu. But what they've also added for the X Pro 2 here is the addition of something called My Menu. So that's in the main menu option. Out of the box, there's nothing in it, but you can go through and choose whichever menu functions you want from the main menus and throw it into the My Menu. Then when you press the menu button, it'll default go to the My Menu, so you've got all those functions right at your fingertips. So between, a number of customizable function buttons, a queue menu, this customizable My Menu, and just in general having the menus be well laid out and intuitive, and being able to use that toggle button to jump through menu options quickly, you're not going to be spending a lot of time in the menus on the X Pro 2. It's very well set up for that. Now, I think that's a feature that some people maybe tend to underestimate, but intelligent and intuitive menu design and customizable functions is really, really important towards helping you be able to shoot quickly and effectively on your camera. The less time you're hunting around in menus and so on, the more time you're shooting, the more time you're going to enjoy using the camera. So that's, I think, a really big deal that maybe not everybody would consider. So that's a list of the more notable features on the X Pro 2. It's certainly not every update that they've made to it, but definitely the more important ones. Now, what I'll mention, going back to what I said at the beginning of this video, there's not really one killer feature on this list that I would single out and say that, this makes or breaks the camera, but they all work together so well. The combination of intuitive menu controls and customization and the ability to jump through menus quickly, the fact that the viewfinder, whether optical or digital, is just a pleasure to use, the fast autofocus system on here, and the really excellent picture quality that comes out of the camera, just all together combined to make it just a really, really good shooting experience with the X Pro 2. So I can definitely say that I really enjoyed my time with the Fujifilm X Pro 2, and I think you will too. As always, if you want to learn more about it or try it out, come into one of our stores. We have stores in the Sydney CBD, Bondi Junction, Miranda, Melbourne CBD, and Brisbane CBD. You can also purchase the X-Pro 2 on our website at www.digidirect.com.au. Take care.